Good evening. My name's Suzanne Leal and I'm the host of Thursday Book Club. For anyone who's new, who's watching us either live or might be watching us later, we meet weekly at 8 p.m. on Thursdays. Once a month or so, a guest author joins us. To be part of Thursday Book Club, please go to my website, suzanneleal.com, where you'll find the subscription form. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I understand that Drew Rooke is as well, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, I'm delighted to have Drew Rooke as my guest. Drew is a writer, a journalist, and the author of One Last Spin, The Power and Peril of the Pokies, and A Witness of Fact, which was shortlisted for the 2022 Ned Kelly Award for Best True Crime. Welcome to our Thursday Book Club, Drew.
Thanks for having me.
Your book, and I'll just pop it up so everyone can see it, is subtitled, at least partly subtitled, The Peculiar Case of Colin Manock. Who is this peculiar case, or peculiar man, perhaps, Colin Manock?
So Colin Manock, or the peculiar Colin Manock, was South Australia's former chief forensic pathologist who was in charge of performing autopsies in South Australia for the best part of 30 years. He took the job in 1968 and was in the position until 1995. Colin, as a person, was a very well-spoken, very well-dressed, and very confident Englishman. He was born in Lancashire in 1937, on the cusp of World War, and he had a pretty standard upbringing from at the time. His dad worked in one of the cotton mills in Lancashire. His mum worked even harder at home, caring for the family. And Colin, from an early age, had an interest in forensic pathology and in kind of anatomy of animals, and he would go out shooting with his father in the countryside. And in an interview that he gave, spoke about being fascinated with the with the insides of frogs and with the animals that he was shooting, and he would kind of dissect these animals. So that, I guess, drive to be engaged in that sort of work went back to an early age.
And so he qualified in medicine. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, that's correct. So he qualified, with a medical degree from the University of Leeds in the 1960s. And after he graduated with his medical degree, he did the kind of standard rotations through different departments in hospitals. Importantly, never trained or never underwent the specialist training in the field of forensic pathology and the subfields of forensic pathology, like histopathology, which is the analysis of tissues. But despite that, he obtained a position at the University of Leeds in the Department of Forensic Pathology, initially just on a casual basis, and then later on a full-time basis. And that was, I guess, where he performed his first autopsy. And it was, he was learning the ropes kind of as he went. He was lecturing whilst also doing kind of practical work. But the key thing is that there was never any kind of dedicated period of training. And some might say, well, that's just how it was back then. But a lot of his peers who I spoke to, who were going through study at around the same time, disagree with that, and they themselves went through extensive study and training, whereas Colin didn't. And that was a very, very serious handicap So, for instance, when if you're not trained in the study of tissue samples, you're severely limited in your ability to identify whether there's a certain injury or a certain disease in a tissue sample, or if there's not. And that, of course, is a critical skill for a forensic pathologist whose very job it is to determine the cause of death in a person.
And just going back, I don't have a medical background, so just going back to the role of a forensic pathologist, for me, it just means that they conduct autopsies. Is that essentially the job?
That is essentially the job. They will also visit, visit death scenes to assist them in that process of determining cause of death, as well. The cause of death, but also as much as they are able to, the time of death, and the insights that a forensic pathologist provide are critical for a number of reasons. One of which is, from a legal perspective, it falls at the feet of a forensic pathologist to say whether someone died at the hands of someone else, and if that was an accidental death or if it was murder, or if they died simply by accident, whether that be a suicide or a natural death. So the findings of a pathologist, can direct the course of a police investigation, and whether or not a police investigation is launched or not. But from a public health perspective, the work of a pathologist is also critically important, because they might discover, a public health emergency that was previously undiscovered in a person. They might find a new disease, or the impact of say cigarettes on the lungs, for instance, is something that pathologists can detect. So there are many reasons why a forensic pathologist plays a very critical role in the law, but also in broader society.
I mean, it's very interesting. And so coming from a novelist perspective, of course, the combination of death, medicine and law is a pretty interesting one. It can be obviously a gruesome one, but one in which there's all sorts of cases that might arise. Having said that, there are a lot of things to write about, and it takes a long time to write a book. Why did you think, I think I'm going to write a book about this Dr. Colin Manock?
My introduction to the bigger story of Colin Manock was the case of Derek Bromley, which some people may have read about in the news over the last couple of days, because Derek Bromley is currently trying to clear his name in the High Court of Australia after being convicted of murder in 1984. He has always maintained his innocence for that murder. Colin Manock's evidence was critical to the conviction of Derek Bromley. Maybe we can go into that case in a little more detail later. But Derek Bromley was that was my introduction to the case. But as soon as I started to make a few calls to people who had been researching Manock for much longer than I had, chief among them a legal academic in Adelaide, Dr. Bob Moles, I saw that the story was much, much bigger than this one particular case. It was indicative of a kind of a rot within the justice system of South Australia. And I was very interested in trying to understand how, after such a long period of time, this ghost of Manock and his work over 30 years was still haunting, and is still haunting the justice system in this country. It could have been addressed a long time ago. It wasn't addressed, and it just seemed odd to me that was the case. And then, to me, it was also a story about it was a story about the dangers of intellectual arrogance and the importance of epistemic humility, of saying, I can be wrong, I don't know everything. And I think that was probably for me personally, the most compelling reason to dive into this story, because I really was trying to understand what can really go wrong on a personal level, but also on a systemic level, when someone believes that they know everything, and in Colin Manock's own words, that he doesn't think differently to the world. It's the world who hasn't caught up to him.
And so is your book an answer to that statement of arrogance?
Is it an answer? I guess I tried to write it in a way that wasn't arrogant, and to I guess just highlight what can happen when people who are in power don't ask themselves, am I wrong? Could I be wrong? Is there another alternative that I haven't thought of? And I mean, you see that sort of thinking in so many areas of contemporary politics. There have been many moments when, or since this book was published and since I was working on this book, where I've heard someone in a position of power say something, and I could have been mistaken for thinking that it came from Colin Manock's mouth. But I tried in writing this book to be as clinical and precise as I was able to, and to really kind of dissect his career in a way that forensic pathology itself should be practiced, and that most forensic pathologists do practice it that way. And speaking to many of Colin Manock's peers was a real inspiration for me in the course of writing it, because they were very, very dedicated scientists who understood the power and the responsibility that they held in their roles as guardians of the dead, as one of them put it to me. And I guess by extension wanted to continue that kind of guardianship.
I think the best way to put into perspective what Dr. Manock was charged to do and what access he had to people is to perhaps talk a little bit about a couple of the cases. You've spoken about Bromley, but I'd like to start with the murder of a 15-year-old girl called Deborah Joan Leach. What happened to her?
Yeah, so this was one of Manock's first major cases after taking the role of chief forensic pathologist in South Australia. She had had a normal day at school. This was in 1971. Had returned home and had gone for a walk on the beach in Adelaide with her dog, and several hours later hadn't returned home. Her parents raised the alarm. A search party was sent out. The police were called, and several hours later, her body was found on the beach. Manock was living nearby at the time, and soon after her body was found, he visited the beach to inspect her body before, going back to the Adelaide to conduct the post-mortem on her body. And he gave a very, very precise time of death, which many of his colleagues later questioned, and a handful of his colleagues at the time questioned privately. And the basis of his time of death analysis was the contents of her stomach. That was at the time already a very disputed method for gauging when someone had died, and it has since been completely kind of disrefuted. But I mean, importantly, at the time it was already not really being used by Manock's peers to do this. But that piece of evidence about the time of death was critical to the conviction of Fritz Van Beelen, who was convicted for Deborah's murder, and who always maintained his innocence.
Can you just give a picture of Fritz? So I just want a picture of who was Fritz Van Beelen? Van Beelen? Where was he? How do you imagine him?
Yeah, so Fritz was just he was a local guy from Adelaide. He was looking for work at the time. So a pretty run of the mill bloke from the kind of biographical information that I had available to me about him. And he was on the beach at around the time that that Deborah was there, but he had an alibi, which I can't remember the exact timing. It was like 4:20 in the afternoon. He was meeting a friend in Adelaide CBD, who confirmed that he was in Adelaide CBD at a particular time. And Manock's time of death analysis meant that it was possible that Fritz Van Beelen was still on the beach when Deborah was murdered. But when if Manock's time of death had been a couple of minutes later, it was impossible that Fritz Van Beelen could have been there, because of how long it would have taken him to drive to his to the city to see his friends. So in court, Manock was cross-examined about this time of death, and was asked, could it be 15 minutes later? Is it possible that it was 15 minutes later after you said that Deborah had died? To which Manock said no. To which he was then asked, is it possible that it could be 10 minutes after? To which Manock said no. Could it be possible that it was 5 minutes after? To which Manock said no. And that precision is frankly impossible for a forensic pathologist to give based on time of death. But it was essentially what the police needed to secure their conviction of Fritz Van Beelen.
And look, I'm just imagining myself in the jury. Expert evidence can be very powerful, particularly when it's confidently given and when it's not shaken under cross-examination. So the jury then convicted Van Beelen. What happened to him? Did he serve his sentence? Was he successful in an appeal?
So he was originally sentenced to death, and that was then reduced to life imprisonment. He, after a series of appeals, a series of appeals were ultimately unsuccessful. It reached the High Court, and the High Court spoke very, very strongly against Manock's evidence in this case, but his conviction was still upheld.
So he's been released, but he's a convicted murderer on the basis, it would appear, or you would surmise, of an overly accurate estimate of time of death.
That's correct.
Sorry, inaccurate, a time of death that gave no leeway.
A time of death that gave absolutely no leeway, not even a couple of minutes. And I mean, on your point about the jury and what they see when they're in court. I think this is a really, really critical point. I mean, you have someone who's walking into the courtroom who is a doctor who is from England, and let's remember this is 1960s in Australia, where there's a bit of cultural cringe going on. Arguably, there's still a bit of cultural cringe happening now, where they hear an English accent and think that that's someone who can be trusted. And in many ways, that's how Manock got his job in the first place, despite not being qualified, and despite his bosses at the time knowing that he wasn't qualified, but they were desperate to fill the position, and they had this young English doctor come along and apply for it. And they gave it to him, hoping that he would upskill on the job after he had started, which didn't happen. And in fact, Manock resisted attempts by his bosses to get him to train and undergo the kind of study and qualifications that he needed. He ultimately got those qualifications. Got them is probably too strong of a word. He was more gifted them, in the sense that he wasn't required to do the 5 years of study and extensive written examination to obtain those qualifications, and instead it was arranged for him to give a very, very short oral examination that lasted a matter of minutes. And when Manock when Manock's bosses tried to employ someone above him, when they realized that the situation was very, very problematic, he successfully sued them for constructive dismissal, arguing that he was the director of forensic pathology, and to have someone employed above him, that would no longer make him the director of forensic pathology, because someone would be then directing his work. Now, all of that information wasn't told to juries at the time, and that's I guess that's the key issue, or one of the key issues with all of the cases that Manock was involved in, is that he was presented as a trained, qualified expert when there were in fact serious questions about his qualifications and his training.
Another case that particularly, well, I suppose, engaged me or horrified me was the case of Henry Keogh and Anna Jane Cheney. Now, they were engaged to be married when she died. How did she die?
So Manock said that she died by forcible drowning, that specifically she was grabbed by her leg whilst she was in the bath at her home in Adelaide, and then had her head held underwater and her legs held up in the air. Now, Manock based that diagnosis on a range of factors, but the critical factor that he based that on was a supposed grip mark around her leg that basically he said fitted the hands of a man. There were finger marks and a crucial thumb mark on the inside of the leg. This was questioned at the time of this case, which was in 1994. There were doubts then that the supposed grip mark was in fact a grip mark. But ultimately, Henry Keogh was convicted of Anna Jane Cheney's murder on the basis of Manock's diagnosis of forcible drowning. Keogh, like Bromley, like Van Beelen, maintained his innocence. He obtained various expert reports of the forensic evidence, which threw into doubt the validity even more than it had been thrown into doubt during the trial itself. And these expert reports said that there was no conclusive evidence that this was a bruise at all. and if it was a bruise, then it could have been up to several days old. This scandal just kind of bubbled away throughout the late 90s into the early 2000s. It consumed a lot of the legal and medical community in South Australia for that time, and was a kind of political hot potato that no one wanted to touch, which was part of the reason why it went on for so long. Because to open the can of worms that was the Henry Keogh case would force the state government to open a much larger can of worms that is the Manock story. But ultimately, they were forced to open at least the Henry Keogh can of worms. They passed legislation in 2013 allowing for a new right of appeal if fresh or compelling evidence had come forward since the trial. And the passage of those laws, I should say, was in many ways thanks to the advocacy of people like Dr. Bob Moles, who kind of follows the law like it's a religion, has a very, very kind of pure understanding of it, and to him a story like Manock is akin to blasphemy in a serious sense, in a very, very serious sense. So he was pushing for these laws because he saw that there were legal issues, really, really rotten legal issues stemming from Manock's work. Henry Keogh was the first person to bring forward a case and successfully appeal it on the basis of these laws, and the Supreme Court of South Australia completely trashed Manock's evidence, agreeing with the multiple expert reviews of the forensic evidence that was available. And I should add that the forensic evidence that was available was very minimal, because Manock didn't keep very good records of his work as is required by pathologists. He took a minimal number of tissue slides of the supposed bruises. The photographs were substandard. So the pathologists who did review their work did the best that they could, but nonetheless, they were still working from the same material that Manock had based his diagnosis off. And they all said that it was very, very, very unlikely that Anna Jane Cheney had been murdered. And in fact, it was much, much more likely that she had in fact had a tragic fall in the bath and had hit her head and fallen unconscious after drinking a small amount, but in a bath, the effects of alcohol and on the body can be increased. And it's, as anyone who may have had a glass of wine in the bath may know, it's very possible to become lightheaded. And they all said that is far more likely what happened, that she had slipped and hit her head and fallen under the water and had tragically drowned.
You started off the conversation talking about the Bromley case, and rather than ask you questions about that case now, I'd encourage everybody to keep up to date with the news, because as you've said, it's with the High Court. The interesting thing that I found about that case was the musings of Robin Malera, who is Bromley's sister-in-law and who became his strongest advocate. And this is what she said: people who are imprisoned are one of the most othered groups. They're out of sight, out of mind. Whatever image there is of them in the public consciousness is so skewed and fear-based. Who's going to care about them? Why would you give someone who's called a murderer the benefit of the doubt? People aren't generally touched by it. It's such a political game. The human condition makes me sad, in the sense that we're so okay with somebody else being thrown under the bus. Does that paragraph encapsulate why perhaps you wrote the book, or what drove you to keep going with it?
Thanks for pulling that out, because that is a huge reason. I think that does really encapsulate a key part of my thinking in writing this book, which is I guess the kind of black and whiteness that the law can paint the world with, and the way in which, you know, we, or all of us, kind of depend somewhat for our own sanity on that kind of black and white thinking at times. And you know, if someone's designated a murderer based on expert evidence, then we all, I think, want to some degree agree with that decision, because if we don't agree with that decision, then one, we start to question the science and the evidence with which that conviction was based on, and two, the whole court system that we think you know, secures our social order. And so I guess it's much easier to throw someone under the bus and accept that the system is working than dwell in the much more uncomfortable gray area where there are so many questions about the functioning of the justice system in this country. And I mean, this is just one example, right? Like you could write a book on so many other failings of the justice system, whether that be First Nations deaths in custody, whether that be the failure of the justice system to adequately deal with sexual violence. But I think it is important to question these systems, and you know, in however small way, I'm trying to do that with this book, and show that there are serious problems with forensic science, and there have been serious problems with forensic science for a really long time. And the story of Manock is a microcosm of much broader questions around the reliability of forensic science. And those issues aren't necessarily the fault of any one person in particular, and it's not a personal attack on anyone in particular, me saying that. It's a systemic problem that stems from the fact that many forms of forensic science haven't actually emerged out of scientific laboratories. They've emerged out of police laboratories, where, of course, the motivation is very, very different. In scientific laboratories, it's about science, and in police laboratories, it's about prosecution. And over many, many years, those practices have just been handed down and accepted by people who are working very hard and might not have the time to stop and question, hey, is this actually valid or not? And courts have also accepted those forms of forensic science as being true and certain. But more and more information is coming out to show that that is not the case. And you know, I think it's tempting to think that everything is or forensic science is solely reliable. But yeah, it's not the case. And I mean, I don't want to go into kind of conspiracy territory here either. I mean, I'm not saying there's this grand conspiracy at play. But it's, you know, just it's human error. I mean, mistakes are made in the course of scientific practice, and it's just important that is addressed.
There's a lot to digest. It's been a lot to think about in terms of challenging both the medical profession and the legal profession, and to see what may happen if left unchecked. So our viewers might just want to sit with that. But if you have some questions, can I suggest that you keep your mute button on, but just pop a question in the chat function. And I'll I'll just ask Drew another question while we see if there's any questions at all. No pressure. This is the No Pressure Book Club. What I'm interested in, finally, Drew, is what's the reaction been to your book?
The reaction has been very, very positive. I'm not sure what Colin Manock thinks of the book. I haven't heard from him. I tried my utmost to contact him when I started writing the book, and at the very, very, very end of writing the book before it went to print. But I was unsuccessful in speaking to him directly. But from people in the medical community, people who work in forensic science, the reviews and response has been very, very positive. And I think that sort of response from that section of the community was really important to me, because I didn't want to trash forensic scientists through telling this story. That wasn't my mission at all. I wanted to show that, you know, Manock and the way he practiced is an anomaly within a community of very, very careful practitioners. So knowing that I kind of got the science right was really rewarding, and really, really nice to hear. And similarly, hearing from lawyers that I got the law right was also, for similar reasons, really, really important to me. And also from people who have been involved in this story for much longer than I have, as I mentioned. I mean, yeah, as I said, it's been bubbling away really since in a big way since the Henry Keogh case, which was when Manock really retired as well in 1994. And it's because of, you know, their work that I was able to write this book, and their generosity of sharing their research and opening up their archives to me. And included in that group of people are people who are, you know, directly involved or directly impacted by Manock's work. And that, yeah, to know I've kind of I guess done justice to their work and this broader story is a really nice thing to hear. And just, yeah, I guess from general readers, most have been kind of gobsmacked by this story. I think it is a national story. I think in many ways it's an international story as well. But for so long it was confined to South Australia. Most people who I spoke with in South Australia on my research trips there, if they didn't know the details, at least knew about Manock. And often I would say, you know, the name Colin Manock, and the response would be like, oh, the kind of the strange forensic pathologist. So there was a kind of, yeah, an awareness within South Australia, but I think more broadly, this is a story that has gone unrecognized. And so, yeah, hearing response from national readers has been really nice.
I've got a question from Barbie, and I think it's probably a question that would interest everybody, which is, what would you like to happen as a result of your book?
I think what the book really points to is the need for improved systems when it comes to assessing forensic science in courts and the validity of forensic science in courts, and also the appeals process in the country, and improving ways for people who have been convicted of crimes to bring their cases forward for review, which is a very, very difficult process in Australia right now. In the UK, there is a body called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which also exists in other similar jurisdictions. And that body was set up basically as a response to similar scandals in the UK involving questionable forensic science. And so having a body like that in Australia, I think, would be a really important step to improving people's access to justice here. And yeah, as I mentioned, the way in which forensic science is kind of assessed in courts, and obviously there have been many changes since Manock was practicing, but there are still issues where, you know, it's kind of left to the jury to, in many cases, decide the validity of evidence. It's very technical, very scientific evidence that, you know, experts, doctors are debating in the witness stand, and I think that that's a huge ask of a jury of lay people. I think above all, though, I would really like to see some acknowledgement from the state of South Australia about how much of I'll bite my tongue. An apology from the state of South Australia about what's happened, and which the state oversaw for a really long time and knew about for a really long time. There seems to be this attitude in South Australia right now of people just hoping that this will go away with time. And Manock is, you know, retired in 1995. He's getting on in his years, and, you know, hopefully the ghost of Manock will float away with his death. I doubt that will happen, because there is still lingering injustices at play, and not known injustices or known possible injustices, but there's also just so much mystery around the extent of this scandal, because Manock was, as I said, employed for 30 years. He was involved with, by his count, around 4,000 criminal convictions, which is one thing, but he was also involved in around 10,000 autopsies over his career. Now, even if not all of them are related to a crime, I think it's still important for there to be some acknowledgement that those autopsies were conducted by someone in a position of power who wasn't necessarily qualified or trained to be in that role, and there were serious questions from the beginning of his career relating to those matters. If I was a relative of someone whose body had been examined by Manock, I think the very least that I would ask for is some sort of acknowledgement like that from the state, because I would find it very difficult to trust the reliability of the finding of the cause of death provided by someone like Manock.
And the power of journalism, to long-form journalism, to sit down, to dissect, as you have, a career, a state, and so many convictions. It's a particularly readable book. It's written clearly and in a detailed manner, but it tells stories. So it's a book of stories of a man, stories of people who have found themselves in jail, the stories of the dead, and it's look, congratulations, Drew. It's a fascinating book. I think we're going to call it a night. Thank you very much, everybody, for your company. This interview will be up on YouTube, and I'll pop a link in the next newsletter. Thanks so much for your time and for your work, Drew, and thanks everybody for your attendance.
Thanks for coming.
See you. Goodbye.